listen, here's the deal. We all make mistakes, right? Each and every one of us. It's funny when you say that, and husbands and wives look at each other over something like that happened yesterday. And some of them are minor, right? Like I'm constantly apologizing to a friend here or my spouse or one of the kids for something I say or do that was just a little bit off. So on America Day, we set off fireworks at the end of our driveway, and anybody else do that, fireworks at their house? We don't go crazy with any of the illegal ones that shoot up in the air that you have to go to Pennsylvania to get. I go to one of the local fireworks stands, and I buy a handful of those, and we love just to set them off. And last year, I was actually smart because I waited till after July 4th, and a couple weeks later, they were just about to close down one of the fireworks stands, and it wasn't buy one, get one free. It was buy one, get like 3 free, and so I bought a bunch of them then, and so we had some of the more expensive, the big ones. They were sitting in my closet all year long, and I could not wait for this America Day to go out and light them. So the sun goes down, Emily's parents are over, we go out, and a lot of the neighborhood kind of congregates at the end of our driveway, and so we're starting to light the fireworks. Got them all set up there. We got a row of chairs in front of our driveway, and the grandparents settle in, and the kids settle in, and our neighbor to the left came out, and they weren't doing this last year. They didn't come out at all last year. I think they were on vacation, and he had bought some of the ones that shoot up that are illegal. And before I could light any of our fireworks, Salsa had just settled into the evening and did not see that he was lighting a firework. And the noise of that thing when it came out scared her so much. She ran over to Mom, she jumped in her arms, and she buried her head in Emily's chest and started crying. And so we're trying to calm her down. It's okay, it's just noise, there's nothing to be afraid of. Jerk, right? Like I'm looking over at him, and so I spend probably the next half hour just trying to calm her down. Come on, Salsa, you can get out. We can enjoy ourselves here. But she was so shook by the experience, she was not going to move. At one point, I even pulled her out, and I said, and this is so different. The past 3 years, she'd gotten to the point where she would run with her friends. She would hold sparklers, and she even lit a couple of the fireworks last year. Not this year. And so she buried her head in Mom's chest. I was starting to get frustrated as a parent because I get Emily's doing the whole, the motherly thing and trying to offer counsel and encouragement. And my role in this is I want to inspire and encourage greatness out of my kids. So I keep going, Salsa, come on, you got this, kid. You can do it. I pulled her over for conversation. I got down her level. I said, Salsa, there's nothing to be afraid of. Just then, the neighbor, bam, sends another one up to the sky. She runs out of my arms, goes back into Emily's. And I'm like, Emily, this is your moment. Rise up and free this child from your arms, right? And I was so frustrated at that point. I just wanted her to enjoy herself, and she wasn't having any fun. And I looked at Emily and I said, you're the one who's making her weak. Not my best moment. But I apologized, right? And I said, oh, sorry, sweetheart, I shouldn't have said that. And we moved on, right? I mean, that's how it works. It's a minor moral infraction. It's not going to blow up my marriage or cause years of lifelong trauma. We all make mistakes. Some of them minor, like the one I described. On the other hand, from time to time, some of the mistakes we make fall into the category called major, right? And the fallout from those major blunders can leave scars that last a lifetime, blow up relationships, maybe usher in a season in our lives of anxiety and depression. And if we're honest, probably every one of us in this room have a small collection of these major blunders, and they can cause pain, and they can leave regret. The disciples, and we've been charting their highs and lows for weeks now, and they have plenty of good moments, right, mixed in with the bad. And they've made minor mistakes along the way, like the time Jesus said, this is my plan, and Peter said, no, Jesus, that's not what you're doing. And Jesus is like, no, get thee behind me, Satan. Or the time James and John were arguing about who would be the greatest, or when the disciples, tried to stop these parents from getting a little bit of Jesus time with their kid, and Jesus had to rebuke them. Right? From time to time, we see these minor blunders by the disciples, and Jesus has to call them out, and apologies are exchanged, and lessons are learned, and we just kind of move on. But today, we're going to dig into a couple of the major mishaps and maybe learn from how each disciple responded to the major mistake that they made. Two men named Judas Iscariot and Simon Peter. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So for the sake of time today, I'm not going to read through all the text that describes these blunders in full, but you can follow along if you want to. But we're going to kick off talking about a man named Judas Iscariot, right? Best known not for the fact that he left everything to follow Jesus or not for the fact that he was in charge of the group's finances. He's most known as the guy who betrays Jesus to the authorities so they can kill him. But you can read the first part of his story if you want to follow along in Matthew 26 or Mark 14 or Luke 22 or John 13 and 18. You can pick any of those. But the synopsis is this. So things are kind of winding down for Jesus and his time on earth. The pressure from the Jewish leaders to off Jesus has reached a boiling point, and they have a plan. All they need is a person, right? All they need is someone who has access to Jesus, someone on the inside, someone maybe with a weakness they can expose, a soft spot, if you will. Enter Judas Iscariot, who I'm sure loved Jesus, but had a weakness that was left unguarded. And as you think about what went down with Judas, I wonder if maybe it was the pressure that got to him, right? Maybe he sensed that things at this point were not going to end well for Jesus. There were conspiracy theories out there, and if they don't end well for Jesus, they're not going to end well for the 12. After all, he had given up everything to follow Jesus. He gave up his job. He gave up his comfortable lifestyle, the comfort of his own bed. He'd given up everything for Jesus. And really, what had he gotten in return? I mean, the fame was probably nice at times, and he got chosen by a rabbi. That was pretty cool. The influence over the crowds, but there's something in his life that he thought was missing. And for a while, by the way, it looked right in their eyes to the disciples like Jesus was going to be king. I mean, that's what they thought, that he was going to go to the capital city and kick out the Romans. They were going to sit on thrones and judge Israel. And when you have a kingdom, along with the kingdoms comes riches. And I wonder if Judas realized as that dream was beginning to evaporate and there was talk about killing Jesus, and even Jesus himself was alluding to the fact that he wasn't going to be around much longer, that he was starting to realize this whole kingdom thing might not happen. And if there's no kingdom, there's not going to be any riches. And maybe he started to figure out, I've got to secure my own financial future. How was he going to do that? Well, there was a price on Jesus' head, so to speak. And knowing that was the case, knowing that he had access to Jesus, knowing he was running out of time, Judas makes up his mind to do what he's going to do. It was in that moment that Luke 22:3 says that Satan entered Judas, and he sneaks away from the other disciples, and he sets up a meeting with the chief priests who had the means and the resources to pay him, and says, if the price is right, I'll hand Jesus over to you. By the way, this was not a surprise to Jesus. In Mark 14, while they're enjoying what is come by us to be known as the Last Supper, they're sitting around this table. Jesus just flat out, they're having this meal together. Jesus says to all the guys sitting around the table, by the way, one of you are going to betray me, right? You can bet in that moment, right? Judas already knows the plan is in place. He's just waiting for you can bet he's probably starting to sweat and his hands are getting a little bit clammy, and he's probably feeling like all the eyes in the room are on him, and he's starting to get real nervous, and all the disciples are starting to whisper amongst each other, who could it be? Like, one of us? Nobody in this room is going to do that. And maybe in an attempt to deflect the notion that he would ever do that, maybe when he's starting to feel like all the eyeballs are looking at him, he blurts out, not me, Jesus. I'd never do that, Jesus. And in the gospel, according to Matthew, it's clear as crystal. Jesus answers back. And I'm assuming there were so many mini conversations going on then. The other disciples maybe didn't hear this. But it's clear as crystal. Jesus says, actually, Judas, bruh, it is you. And what you've agreed to do, go get it done quickly. And while everyone's distracted, Judas scurries out and sets the plan in motion, right? So hours later, Jesus and his peeps are in the Garden of Gethsemane alone at night, no crowds around. And Judas shows up on the scene with an angry mob, and they're sent by the chief priests, and they have swords and clubs and weapons with them, and that's when Judas approaches Jesus. And I imagine as he walked into the garden ahead of the mob, the other disciples probably were like, Judas, dude, where were you? Why'd you leave supper early, Judas? Judas, what's going on here, Judas? And he walks up to Jesus, and the agreed upon signal was a kiss, and he plants one on Jesus, and the mob seizes him, and Judas gets the money, and the assassination plot is on. By the way, there's an amazing detail in the betrayal of the John account. John 18:6. Jesus asks the mob, right? So this mob comes into the Garden of Gethsemane, and in John 18:6, Jesus asks the mob, like, who are you here for? And the mob, as they're rushing at Jesus, says, we're here for a man named Jesus. I love this. And Jesus looks at this angry mob, armed with weapons, and says, I am Jesus. And John records that when he said those words, I'm who you're looking for, like the mob literally drew back and fell to the ground. Like, what? I mean, what power? What grace? What authority must have emanated it from Jesus that he could stare down an angry mob who was there to arrest him, and at his name, they all fall down like 10 pins on a perfect strike. There's power in the name of Jesus. As an aside, Mark records something I think is one of the most odd, under-talked about verses in the Bible. Most of us probably don't even, when we think about the march to the cross, this is probably not the part of the story that even comes to mind if we even know it's in the Bible at all. But like that night in Mark 14, so they come in, the soldiers, and they take Jesus off, and the disciples are scared for their lives, and they panic, and they run off in all different directions. And Mark 14 records, as everybody's fleeing the scene, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. How come we don't talk about this Bible verse more? I never remember this one growing up in Sunday school. But you see, association with Jesus is a dangerous thing. And when everything is going well, and we're in a place like this, and everybody next to us loves Jesus, and it's easy to stand up and sing his praises, it's kind of easy to be a follower. But when the pressure's there, and the culture is mocking, and the biblical worldview is called outdated and out of touch, and Christians are labeled as haters when being Christian is not cool, are you willing to pick up your cross and follow then? Or are you going to run and cover and hide? It's not a bad question. Anyways, let's get back to Judas in a bit and move on to Peter. Peter's denial, by the way, which is equally famous and well known by people, is to me not on the same level as the Judas betrayal in this regard. It was not premeditated, right? Like, he had a weak moment and did something he never should have done, but this wasn't planned out. This wasn't something Peter ever thought he was going to do, and we've all had moments like that. We're caught off guard, and we're weak, or we're tired, and we do or say something, and we regret it instantly. I had a lousy parent moment a few years ago. We're living in the rental house, and Emily was in the hospital, I think, with Luna at the time. Dryden and Soleil were upstairs in Soleil's bedroom, carrying on, jumping around, doing videos, whatever. I don't know. They were just loud. And right below their room was where Thad was sleeping. And I'm trying to get the kids to sleep, right? And so I need the house quiet just for a little bit, just to let them get. But all I hear is them upstairs thumping around. And the floor is like, it sounds like a herd of elephants. And so I'm yelling upstairs, Dryden, Soleil, shh, keep it down, keep it down. I'm trying to get the kids to sleep, right? Nothing changes. They keep on thumping, they keep on jumping, whatever they're doing up there. And so I yell a second time, hey guys, could you keep it down until I can get the kids to sleep? Thad's right below your room, Soleil. Nothing changes. And at that point, I'm frustrated. I'm like, I got to get these guys to sleep. So like Dryden and Soleil, top of the stairs, right? So they come out of the room, and they go to the top of the stairs, and I'm at the bottom of the stairs. And I said to them in a nice, calm voice, girls, I've already told you twice. Please keep it quiet so Thad can fall asleep. Just like that. And Soleil says these words to me. Parents, you know this. Papa, why are you yelling at us? Yelling? You think that's yelling? Do you want me to show you what yelling is? I've never done this before. I have never done this since. I pray I never do it again. But in a weak moment, exhausted and exasperated, having heard my child accuse me of yelling, I said, I will show you what yelling is. And I reached into the deepest part of my soul. And I found a volume in my life I had never found before. And I looked up at my beautiful daughters whom I love and idolize me and said, this is what yelling is. And for the next 30 seconds, I let her rip. And when I finally stopped and sweat is pouring down my body and my eyeballs are out to here, I look up at my kids and they're standing there as white as a ghost. And in that moment, right, I felt horrible, right? And I knew I blew it. To me, that was Peter's blunder, right? I mean, he didn't yell, that wasn't it. But it wasn't planned. He was weak and tired and had a weak moment. They had just finished eating the Last Supper, and Jesus tells them it's time, and they get up and go. And the 3-year run is over. The assassination was in motion, and Jesus tells them, when it goes down, what's about to go down, you're all going to abandon me. And Peter, right on cue, in character, worked out over my dead body, Jesus. If they come for you, they're going to have to take me too. After all, Peter always rose to the occasion. He left his nets to follow Jesus. He was the one when Jesus said, get out of the boat, got out of the boat and walked on water. He's the one when Jesus said, who I am, said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. When they're in the garden, he takes a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. He was brave and bold and a man of action. Not on my watch, Jesus. I'll die for you. But rather than salute him for his intentions, Jesus predicts his infraction. Peter, that sounds all fine and dandy. But let me tell you something. Before the rooster crows, not 1, not 2, but 3 times, you will deny you even know me. 3 times. You'll refuse to admit you even know who I am. 3 times. You're going to be so embarrassed and afraid and so weak, you're going to swear on your mother's grave. You know nothing about who I am. And rather, Peter, right, rather than just pause to go, do I actually have that in me? And let this be a moment to just do some introspection. Peter doubles down on his promise. Not me, Jesus. I'm your guy. I got your back. Everyone else could fall away. Not this guy. And we all know what happens next. There's a prayer meeting in the garden. They all fall asleep. When they finally wake up and they're wiping the sleep out of their eyes, there's a mob there to arrest Jesus, armed with clubs and swords. And when Jesus is carried off, the 12 disperse. They follow at a distance maybe, but they're nowhere to be seen next to Jesus. They all abandon him, just like Jesus said. And Peter's out in the courtyard, and he's no doubt scared for his life at this point. And he's trying at a distance to watch and see what they're doing to Jesus and trying to overhear what they're saying. He's confused, he's cold, and he's weak. And a servant girl walks up to him. It says, wait a second here. You were with Jesus, weren't you? And Peter responds with a bold-faced lie. He says, nope, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then he walks away right from her and is hanging over by a gate when another girl walks up to him and points him out to the crowd and says, hey guys, that man right there? He's one of them. He was with Jesus, and maybe some of the mob that was in the garden that were there that night were standing nearby. Whatever it was, the lie was not enough at this point. At this time, he makes an oath and he swears, I swear, I don't even know the man, which buys him a little bit of time, but before long, those standing nearby not believing the lie, not convinced by the oath, confront him a third time. Like bruh, seriously, you're one of the 12. We've seen you with them free, and your accent, by the way, gives you away. And this time a lie, not enough, an oath, not enough. He swears, right? And calls curses on himself. I don't know Jesus. And like clockwork, just like Jesus said, the second those words fall off his lips, a rooster crows. He had denied him 3 times. Luke, by the way, when he tells the story, adds an interesting detail that highlights the pain of Peter in this moment. Luke 22:61 says this, that when that happened, right, I don't know Jesus, and the rooster crows, at that moment, Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. And that's when Peter remembered the words, before the rooster crows today, you're going to disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. What a painful moment this had to be. Like from Peter's eyes, the moment Jesus needed me the most, I wasn't there. The Jesus who called me and repurposed me and rescued me and gave me grace and hope. I saw a whole world of things I never dreamed possible, and I returned that by, I don't even know Jesus. And Judas betrays him. And Peter disowns him. How do you even come back from that? You talk about 2 spectacular, epic, monumental collapses. There you have it. I mean, can you imagine the guilt? And guilt is exactly what we see play out, right? Judas, for instance. I mean, he got what he was after. They arrest Jesus. It was going to happen sooner or later regardless, so why not make a profit from it? He's in a better place financially now. He's in good with the religious leaders. I mean, things are really looking up for Judas on a personal level, except for one thing, guilt. Matthew 27, when Judas sees that and hears that Jesus is condemned to death, like he's getting the death penalty. They're going to put him to death. They're going to kill him. He is seized with remorse. And he takes the 30 pieces of silver back to the chief priests. He's got to find a way to make it right. I gotta fix this thing that I've done that's so wrong. The guilt is eating him alive. And he runs to them and he cries out, I've sinned. I've betrayed innocent blood. He's like, Jesus didn't do a thing, and I'm so sorry, and I did the wrong thing. Take me instead of him, and I'm so sorry. I never should have done this. And the chief priests laugh in his face. It's too little, too late. It's on you, pal. And so Judas takes the 30 pieces of silver and throws them on the floor. And in a fit of guilt and depression and shame, he does the one thing that can't be undone. Facing the horror of his own sin, he makes the decision to end his own life, and he goes out and he hangs himself and ends up dying before the person he betrayed ever died. G-U-I-L-T. Guilt. Peter, too, was overcome with guilt, right? You remember the moment the rooster crowed and Peter and Jesus lock eyes? Peter's mortified. Caught red-handed with nowhere to hide, just feeling exposed. He runs from the scene of the trial crying like a baby, thinking, what have I done? What have I done? And Jesus is killed and he hangs on a cross and there's no sign of Peter, filled with depression, overcome with guilt like Judas. He makes a decision that before too long, we've given up the dream. The 3-year run is over. I'm just going to go back and do what I did before I met Jesus. I'm going to go back to fishing. I'm going to live my life in obscurity, and I just never have to deal with anything but the water and my own thoughts from now on. Fast forward to a few days later, you know the story. Jesus is alive, right? And he shows himself to the 2 Marys, and they run to the apostles who are in a room. The 11 are in a room gathered together, and they're like, Jesus is alive. We saw him, and none of them believe the 2 women, but it's Peter. It's Peter who gets up from where he is and runs to where the tomb was. He's confused and he's scared. You know why? Like, what if it's true? I denied him. I disowned him 3 times. What if he did come back to life? And he's probably mortified. Can you imagine what that conversation is going to be like? And the guilt that's going around in his mind, and finally Jesus appears to them. And I know Scripture does not record how, I wish it did, how each individual responded the first time they saw Jesus, we know like Judas, or not Judas, Thomas, for example, saw Jesus and doubted, and it was like, I gotta touch the wound. I gotta make sure it's really you. But whatever went down, the first time Jesus revealed, I bet you there were bear hugs and high fives and apologies and people running at Jesus. I can't believe you're alive. I don't think it was that way for Peter. I think maybe instead of running at Jesus, he kind of put his head down. I don't want eye contact with that man. After all, I disowned him. His moment with Jesus comes later. You can read it in John 21, right? A few days later, Peter's out fishing on the water, and they'd been fishing all night and hadn't caught a darn fish. And so it's morning now, and they're about ready to call it quits, but there's someone standing at shore who yells out, "Hey, guys, throw your nets to the other side," right? And so they're all fishermen. They know what they're doing. They've been doing this their whole lives, and they're like, "Fine, whenever you say, that's a dumb idea, but we'll do it just to make you go away." And they throw the nets on the other side, and the nets are so full of fish that Peter then has this flashback, this deja vu, right? Because the same thing happened the day Jesus called him in the first place, and he's like, "Oh my goodness, it's Jesus." And he does the completely normal thing to do. He jumps out of the boat and swims to shore, right? Had he been thinking, he would have just ran. He would have, had the faith. I'd already done this once. It would have been a little bit quicker. And then they're having fish on the beach. And a little bit later, Jesus motions to Peter and says, come here, it's time to talk, right? And they maybe go for a walk on the beach. And they have this conversation in which Jesus asks Peter a question. He says, "Peter, do you love me?" And I've heard so many sermons on this use of the Greek and how the word changes the word for love. And we're not going to unpack any of that today. But, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter's like, "Yeah, of course I love you, Jesus. I get why you would doubt it after what happened if you did. But of course I love you." Jesus, like, "Feed my sheep," right? And 3 times this happens. "Peter, do you love me? And feed my sheep?" "Of course I love you, Jesus." 3 times Jesus asks Peter this question. 3 times Jesus tells Peter, "Feed my sheep." Not a coincidence that was the number of times that Peter disowned Jesus. But at the end of every one of these statements, it was "feed my sheep." In other words, Peter, you still have the same thing I called you to do when I called you to drop the nets in the first place. Feed my sheep, fishmen. And he ends the dialogue by looking Peter in the eye and says, "Peter, follow me. You still belong to me." It's powerful, right? But I want you to think about this. He denied Christ, for crying out loud. "Jesus, I don't even know you. Don't ever call me a Jesus guy. Jesus is the worst. I'd rather die than be seen with that guy." Those were the kind of things Peter said that night. This is no small blunder. This isn't a little white lie. This is not going 30 miles per hour in a 40 zone. In front of a crowd, he renounced his Lord and Savior. "Jesus, you're dead to me." Think about that. To put this in context, and Peter had to know this. Jesus, just a few days prior to that, Jesus was talking to the 12 and said these words, "Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me, denies me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven." Don't think for a minute that promise, that warning wasn't playing itself. I disown Jesus. I've done too much. I've gone too far. I'm past the point of no return. I disown Jesus. I heard his words. Now he's going to disown me. And I talk to people all the time, to be honest, and that's what I hear. I've gone too far. What I've done, who could forgive? There's no hope for me. You don't know my Jesus. I don't care what it is you've done, how far you think you've fallen, what sin it is you think disqualifies you. He didn't die to throw it back in your face. That's what Peter thought would happen. He died to bring you grace. No matter the sin, no matter the infraction, no matter the offense, no matter the mess that you've made of things. But guilt is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because we see it play out in these stories. It will either drive you to Jesus or it'll drive you from Jesus. It's one or the other. Guilt will either reveal your sin and you run to Jesus, or it will reveal your sin and you run from Jesus. You know, things didn't have to end this way for Judas. Had he not run from Jesus? Not run from his guilt? I mean, he realized his sin, right? That's part of the battle. We tell people that all the time. We introduce them to Jesus. You have to confess your sin. You have to realize your sin. He realized his sin. What I did was betrayed innocent blood. What I did was horribly wrong. This should be me and not Jesus. He confesses his sin, for crying out loud, and then tries to make it right. He threw the money back and walked away, but he failed to see. He could not climb out of his own sin mess. And his guilt drove him in the wrong direction. And so there are basically two things we can learn from this today. And the first is this: you can't climb out of your own sin mess. You can't. I mean, you can try. Judas tried. But no matter what you attempt, no matter how many right things you try to do to equal all the wrong things that you do, the guilt stays, the sin stain remains. Because you can't climb out of your own sin mess. He paid the price. He's the only one who can pull you out. Jesus has to pull you out. The second is this: no matter how far you fall, it is not too far for Jesus. Years ago, I was a junior in college, and I was asked by Dr. Peter Vercruyze at our school, who's the head of the homiletics department, and he picked a handful of preachers at our school and said, I want to take you to the National Preaching Summit in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was held at the Adams Mark Hotel, and do you want to go? I'm like, yeah, I'm all in. And it was 3 days where we would sit down Friday night, all day Saturday, and then Sunday morning at the feet of some of the greatest teachers of the word, preachers in the country, and just soak up their knowledge and soak up their wisdom. And I could not wait. So we arrive at the Adams Mark Hotel, and that night they had their first session. And like a kid in a candy shop, I've got my notepad and pen, and I'm writing everything I hear down. And it was awesome. I could not wait for the next morning. And we got up the next morning, and it was a whole day of just sitting and learning and listening. And it was so awesome, but I was tired at the end of the day because my mind had been through the exercise of trying to keep along with these great geniuses, and I didn't want to miss anything. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go straight to bed. It's 9 o'clock. I'm going to get a good night's sleep so I'm ready for the last session in the morning. And so I go up to my room, and I get dressed, I get ready for bed, and I jump in bed. It's probably 9:30, 10 o'clock. And as my head hits the pillow, I'm thanking God for the day, and then this thought pops into my head. There are over 400 preachers in this hotel at this conference. 400 preachers. And they're all going to have come this weekend and gone. And not one single person in this hotel is going to hear about Jesus. And I'm laying in bed and I'm trying to sleep except for this annoying thought that won't go away. There's over 400 preachers in this hotel. They're all going to have come and gone this weekend, hung together in this holy huddle, and no one's ever going to hear about Jesus. And the more I tried to make the thought go away just so I could get a good night's sleep, the more that thought began to bother me. So I said, fine, I'll go for a walk. And I get up out of my bed, and I get dressed, and I reversed everything I had done to get in bed. And I go down the hallway into the elevator, go down to the main floor, and I'm walking along the hallway as I pass the hotel bar. And the song that was playing in the bar that night was the theme song from my high school prom. Oh, what a night, late December, back in 63. It sounded much better live, I promise. And so I walk into the bar just to kind of get my bebop on a little bit, and I sit over at a table, and I order a Diet Pepsi or Coke or something, whatever it was, and I put it on the table. And as I'm just sitting there listening to the music and just looking at this packed out bar on a Saturday night, airport bar, just like a little bit off of the airport. I'm sitting there, and this thought won't go away, so I'm like, fine, I'll pray about it. And so I put my head down, and I was like, God, there's like over 400 preachers in this hotel, and they're all going to have come and gone, and no one's going to hear about Jesus. God, please find someone for me to talk to about Jesus. And I open my eyes, and I look over at the bar, and there's this one man sitting there, and two empty stools, one on either side of him. He's wearing blue jeans and a white muscle shirt, thin guy, muscular though. He's got slick back hair and a 5 o'clock shadow. And I look up at him and my eyes kind of zone in on him. I'm like, okay, I hope he's the guy. right? So I get up and I walk over and I put my Pepsi on the bar and I sit beside him and said, "Hi, what's your name?" And he turns to me and looks at me and says, "What are you doing here?" Like, oh? I said, well, what do you mean? What am I doing here? He said, "What are you doing here?" Sitting, what do you mean? What are you doing here? And he says this. He says, "You're a preacher. What are you doing in here?" After I went upstairs to change my shorts, having been scared to death that my professor had somehow found out or something or leaked information, I'm looking at my shirt. I've got no name tag. I have no idea how he knows I'm a preacher. I have no idea. And I'm starting to panic. I'm starting to sweat. I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I answer this guy? And then it hits me, what I prayed earlier. And so I said, well, there's like over 400 preachers in this hotel. I'm just one of them. And I just feel like they're all going to come and go this weekend, and no one's going to hear about Jesus, so I'm here to tell you about Jesus. It's a great line, right? Feel free to use it at work. His name was Brandon Xavier Elliott. And I asked him if he lived nearby and or if he was in traveling. He said, "No, I live 10 minutes from here." Well, why are you at like an airport hotel bar then? On Saturday night, there's like probably all kinds of bars in Indianapolis. He said, "Yeah." I said, "I can go here because there's ladies that come in for one night or they're here for 2 nights and I can hook up with them and there's no strings attached. So I come here every Friday and Saturday night for that reason." I'm like, oh, can I tell you about? He said, "I already know you're Jesus." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Let me tell you my story." He said, "I grew up in the church. I went to Sunday school for years, had a great Sunday school teacher, loved church, and I got old enough to go in the youth group, and finally I got to do all the cool things, so I went to all the youth group events, and I grew up, and when I graduated high school, I went off to Bible college. So I was in Bible college, getting a degree, and then while I was there, I met this beautiful lady, and so we fell in love, and shortly after college, we got married and started our life together. And 3 years after we got married, I came home early from work one day because I wanted to surprise her with some flowers I had bought. When I walked into our home, I found my wife in bed with the pastor of our church. And I said, "That's it for me." And I walked out of that room and I walked away from her and I walked away from life in church. He said, "I spent the next 3 years of my life, 3 years, drinking as much as I could, day and night, doing as much drugs as I could, sleeping with as many women as anyone who would sleep with. I would sleep with me, I would sleep with them for 3 years. That is a lifestyle. I bottomed out. I came close to the point where I couldn't function, and I was hanging on to my job. And that's when I woke up one morning and said, I've got to get my life back together. I can't let this be how it ends for me. And I decided I was going to go back to church. So I get up early Sunday morning and I walk to the same church. There was a different pastor there now. The same church I'd grown up in and attended church my whole life. And I walked in there a little bit late and sat in the back row. And the worship service was finished and the new pastor got up and talked about grace and love and forgiveness and what it's like to be with Jesus. And at the end of the sermon, they offered an invitation. So at the end of the invitation, I got up out of my seat while the music was playing and began to slowly walk down the aisle to the front of the church. And as I began to pass people and they started to realize who I was, I could hear the whispers. And then I got to the front of the church and I turned around and I confessed in front of the church everything I'd done those past 3 years, the kind of person I had been, the kind of things I had done, how I'd walked away completely from God but fell on my face and I've got nothing now and I just want a chance to come back. And when I confessed everything, the pastor of the church said to me these words. I know this is really emotional giving the history of everything that's gone on, so I'm going to need to talk with the elders and figure out if this is the place for you to worship or maybe we can put you in another congregation. He said, I turned around and I walked out of the church and I swore I will never enter a church again. I'm crushed listening to this story. And I'm trying to tell him, well, it's not too late, and not all churches are like that. And Jesus, he loves you, and he died for you, and he just wants you. And I'm trying to share this truth with him. But 2 ladies had walked up next to him, and were trying to get his attention. They were supposed to, I guess, have met him there. And they were, come on, we need to go now, Brandon. We need to go now, Brandon. And finally, he gets up, and the allure of the women and what was going to go down in their hotel room was too much. So he got up, and he walked away with them. But he stopped, and he turned back, and he looked at me right in the eyes and said these words, Jacques, I know I'm going to die a lonely man. And turned around and walked off. Friends, I don't know what you have done, what path that you have walked that makes you think you've walked too far, or you've strayed too far, or you've done too many wrongs that I could never get back on that path again. I've fallen so far. I don't know what it is you've done, but I do know this. Facing one of the biggest moral blunders in history, when Peter stood eye to eye with Jesus and felt nothing but shame and guilt and pain, Jesus looked him in the eye, and it was this: do you love me? And if you do, bro, bear hug, please. Follow me. Because there's no such thing as too far from Jesus. Because he can clean up any sin mess. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you for the fact when I'm at my worst, and when I stop and try to even total what my sin record would be, how many offenses I've committed over the course of my life, the amount of people that I've wronged, the loose words that I've spoken, when I try to total those up and I'm overwhelmed by them, Father, in one move, your Son wiped the slate clean and said, follow me. And I thank you for your grace, and I thank you for your love, and I thank you for your forgiveness. And if there's anyone in this room who is sitting this morning on the outside looking in, and they feel like they've gone too far, or the road back is just too long, and I can't do it, I've done too much, Father, I pray that this moment, that you would overwhelm them with your love and with your grace, and in an eyeball-to-eyeball conversation with you right now, that you would call them back to you. Thank you for paying the price. Thank you for paving the way. Father, thank you that our guilt, because of you, is not what owns us in the present. It is a thing of the past. And in the name of Jesus, rebuke the enemy who tries to tell people in this room otherwise. In Jesus' name we pray.